With Rick Gates bringing the hammer down on his former friend and the president's old campaign chairman, Paul Manafort. Will his testimony be the key to putting Manafort away for the rest of his life? I don't know, but I have a great panel here to help me out. And first, I want to go through where we stand. When court resumes in about 30 minutes, Rick Gates will be back on the stand for another 3 to 4 hours of testimony. But he has already hit Manafort where it hurts. Remember, these two guys have known one another for over 10 years. They worked together, made millions of dollars together, and even joined the Trump campaign together. But when he finally made it to the stand on Monday afternoon, Gates immediately implicated his former colleague in a laundry list of illegal activity. He was asked, quote, "Did you commit crimes with Mr. Manafort?" Gates responded, "Y-E-S." He then went on to list those alleged crimes. He says the two men concealed 15 foreign bank accounts from the government, using them to hide millions of dollars. He said he also falsified Manafort's tax returns and loan documents to help his former boss obtain millions of dollars more. He said he even lied to Manafort's bookkeepers and tax accountants to keep the money hidden. And Gates says all of it was done under the direction of a Mr. Paul Manafort. But Gates also admitted to committing crimes on his own. He testified that while he was working for Manafort, he was also stealing from him, ultimately embezzling hundreds of thousands of dollars for himself. Now Manafort's legal team is facing an uphill climb as they try to get out from under Gates' testimony. They argue that while Manafort may have made mistakes, as they call them, he didn't lie. They will insist Gates is the only one that actually broke the law. And they are expected to point out that Gates has already pleaded guilty to lying to the FBI and allege that he's lying to the jury as well. We should make it clear, neither President Trump nor his campaign are implicated in these allegations against Manafort or Gates, although both were members of his team. However, the president clearly has a very big stake in the trial's outcome. A victory for the government prosecutors could give the special counsel's investigation a whole lot of added credibility. It could also demonstrate the power of a government witness who flips on a former colleague. On the other hand, if the government loses here, we could end up seeing a whole lot more Trump tweets calling Mueller's investigation a witch hunt. At the very least, I think back to President Trump calling his team the very best people. Just think about that. I want to bring in NBC National Intelligence and Security reporter Ken Dilanian, who was in the courtroom in Virginia. He will be back there in 30 minutes. Ken, what are we expecting today? And I have got to ask you, what was the energy between those two guys?
It was tense, Stephanie. Today we're expecting, obviously, Rick Gates to be back on the stand under direct examination by the prosecutors. He'd only really begun to get into the Ukrainian lobbying and their work for that Russian-backed politician, Viktor Yanukovych, when court ended yesterday. And, you know, up until now, Stephanie, it's been a pretty dry case, a documents case, where we're hearing from bookkeepers and accountants and people who from whom Manafort purchased luxury goods. Now we've got Rick Gates, who knows Paul Manafort, who's known him for years, who can speak to his motives, and he already has done that. And in a word, Stephanie, his assessment of Paul Manafort's motives for this tax evasion is greed. Manafort wanted to pad his income, and prosecutors say that he declared $30 million of income when he actually made $60 million, Stephanie.
30, 60, not chump change either way. Ken, stay with me. I want to bring my panel in. It's a great one. Shannon Pettypiece, my dear friend and White House reporter for Bloomberg News. Midwin Charles is an attorney with the law firm Midwin Charles Associates. All right, Shannon, I want to start with you. Why should the average person who is home right now, having a cup of coffee, on their way to work, why do they care about Paul Manafort and Rick Gates? These are just two guys who seem to embezzle money for themselves.
Well, I would say to pay attention to today. As Ken pointed out, they were just yesterday starting to get into these connections to Ukraine. That could be really, I guess, enlightening to show just how deeply tied Paul Manafort was to pro-Kremlin interests in Ukraine. We already know about this $60 million payment, but there is a sense that there's a lot more here, and we could get a lot more clarity on how tied he is to the Ukraine. And I would also note that even though this has nothing to do with the election, and there is nothing ruling out that there wouldn't be further indictments that could come from Mueller against Manafort or Gates. I have no reporting to indicate that there are any more indictments coming, but I would just say leave open the possibility in your mind that there could still also be more to come on Manafort and Gates as Mueller's investigation continues, or as he sort of unrolls further indictments or his further reports. So I would keep an eye on these two guys.
So you're saying that there's a chance. All right, Midwin, we know what Manafort's attorneys are going to do. They're going to say Gates is the real criminal here. Manafort was a business guy with complicated taxes, and he made a couple of mistakes. Is that going to fly?
Of course they're going to say that. It's their job to say that. Their job is to defend Manafort at pretty much all costs here. However, I just don't know how much it's going to fly. I think from what I've read about Gates' testimony, and I've been following this trial from the very beginning, he's very credible. He's very credible, I think.
Hold on. He's
Absolutely.
very credible? This guy lied to investigators even while negotiating his plea deal. So,
right. I actually think that that makes his testimony about Manafort directing him to lie to the IRS, directing him to change income and call it loans. I think that makes him credible. This is a guy who is willing to lie to the IRS. This is a guy who is willing to sort of buck the system and create, you know, a situation where Manafort makes money. Now, what I think is interesting is he said on the stand that he never benefited personally from the things that Manafort directed him to do. So I think that's
him
an
a
important.
chump.
Well, not necessarily. He also said on the stand that he embezzled hundreds of thousands of dollars from Manafort himself. In other words, this is not a guy who's upright. This is not a guy, you know, who is going to follow the line and work within the rules of IRS and work within the rules of banking laws.
okay, then I ask the same question to you, Ken. In terms of Gates' credibility here, he's a known liar, too.
Sure, Stephanie, but that's very common in these kinds of cases. When you have a cooperator who is part of a criminal conspiracy, they tend not to come from Little Sisters of the Poor. They're criminals. And the point is that the jury is not going to like this guy. He's a very unappealing, unsavory character. But the prosecution wants the jury to believe this guy. And that's why they confronted them up front with all these bad acts, because they don't want there to be any surprises on cross-examination. If the defense can land a punch, it would be some unexpected negative thing in Gates' background that the prosecution hasn't already vetted with the jury. But look, I mean, Gates, I think, is a compelling witness. He speaks in soft tones in an understated manner. He's a military veteran. Yes, he's a liar. Yes, he's an admitted criminal. But this trial is about crimes. It's about bank fraud and tax fraud, and Gates is bringing the jury into the conspiracy.
Soft tones and a military background, and then he appeared to have found a life of crime. These are good guys. All right, Shannon, what should the president, is there anything the president should be super worried about?
At this point, not that we know of, but I think the interaction, the dynamics of these two sort of show a bigger sense of what's going on with the different characters involved in this investigation. Manafort and Gates, people had described them to me as like Batman and Robin, that Gates was Manafort's ally, that no one ever expected Gates to flip on Manafort. But these investigations have a way of breaking down old alliances. Donald Trump and Michael Cohen, Gates and Manafort, and I think that as this investigation plays out and more people are put under stress from legal fees, from questions from Mueller, from grand jury subpoenas, we are going to see alliances just like this one crumble and break down. And I think anything goes. Everyone is game, and all loyalties are off the table as this progresses.
Midwin, how much is on the line here? If this case is successful in getting Paul Manafort, what does that do to Mueller's investigation? And if they're unsuccessful, where do they go? I mean, President Trump is going to be on the witch hunt megaphone if this case doesn't work.
Which is surprising that he could be any more on that megaphone from what we've heard thus far. But I think that
he could stand on top of the wall he wants to build and just keep shouting.
I think this prosecution would bode well for Mueller if he's successful, because what it will say is, listen, I've done the work and I've done the digging, and I think that Trump would be very nervous. Now, it's interesting, a lot of people are saying that when you look at Rick Gates' testimony and how how he flipped on Manafort, that's one of the things that Trump is concerned about, people flipping, alliances being broken. But we have to remind everyone here that there should be no concern for anyone to flip on you if you've done anything wrong, if you've done nothing wrong. So I think that that's one of the things that we have to look out here for. But I think you're right. I think if Mueller secures a victory here, as these prosecutors secure a victory, it will give this investigation added credibility, because many people are saying, you know what, Mueller has gone off on a tangent here. He was initially tasked with just looking at whether or not Russians interfered in our election, and whether or not
money.
Exactly. And so there are many people who feel that this sort of angle of his investigation is not necessary. It's not within the purview of the order that he was supposed to do. So I think that this would give him additional credibility
if you are innocent,
if he secures it.
If you have done nothing, why would one story keep changing?
Exactly.
Ken, I do want to ask you about the friction between the prosecutors and the judge.
That's been a recurring theme in this trial, Stephanie. This judge likes to impose his will on the courtroom in what some observers think is an officious manner. As one of our analysts said, some judges are content to be the umpires. It means obnoxiously sort of imposing his authority. And, you know, some judges are content to be umpires. This one wants to pitch and play shortstop. And I've noticed that a lot of his interference comes with the prosecutors. He is directing their questions, criticizing their questions, preventing them from bringing in, for example, photos of the luxury goods that Manafort purchased. Now, some would argue he may be trying to protect them from an appeal in this case, but he's certainly, you know, and he's trying to move the case along. But sometimes by moving it along, he's taking more time by requiring sidebar arguments and asides by the judge. So it's been kind of maddening at times. Stephanie.
Okay, I got to ask you about this, even though maddening at times is Rudy Giuliani. There's a Washington Post report out that says President Trump's public lawyer, Rudy Giuliani, will send a letter that will, quote, largely rebuff Mueller's request for a presidential interview, although he won't formally decline. What in the world are we talking about here? Is this Rudy Giuliani just trying to run the clock and exhaust us? Yes. He will answer this, he won't answer that. I don't even understand what it matters.
Yes, it matters not, because what
Unless
we have...
he's successful at running the clock.
I don't think it will be successful, because what do we have lately from Donald Trump? We have his tweets. And we have his tweets, who we now know from Sean Spicer and from the current you know, White House press secretary. They are official statements. They are official White House statements of the President of the United States. So he has already said and admitted, despite the fact that he said that initial meeting at the Trump Tower was about adoptions, we now know from his own words that that was about getting opposition information from a foreign entity. So we already have his statements. So Giuliani can run around here and send all the letters that he wants to Mueller. At the end of the day, there is enough information here from Trump's mouth, of his own doing, that he knew what was going on, or perhaps there's a lot of evidence that shows that he may have known what was going on.
So we should point out, yesterday, Don Jr. told Laura Ingraham it was a bait and switch. Now he's saying they went for the opposition research, but once the meeting started, they discussed adoption. None of that makes sense. And remember, it's never really about adoptions, even if they say that. That's code for Magnitsky Act, i.e. sanctions. Thank you so much. Midwin, Shannon, Ken, you got a lot of work to do today, and we're going to leave it there. Over.